Anderson the Spider Silva was considered by many as the greatest fighter to ever grace the octagon at the height of his career. Silva would not only win his fights, but he did it in highlight reel fashion. As of 2020, he is coming off of a couple of losses, and prior to that, Silva had won 2 of his last 7 fights. So how good was Anderson Silva actually? Hey guys, it's Keon, and today I want to talk about former UFC Middleweight Champion Anderson Silva. Specifically, I want to look at his career between 2006 and 2012, where I believe were the years where he solidified himself as an MMA legend. And I also want to talk about where I think Anderson Silva's legacy stands today. Anderson Silva started his MMA career with a record of 6-1 between 1997 and 2001. Silva, who grew up training in Muay Thai, Capoeira, and Taekwondo, quickly grew a reputation as a powerful striker who added a lot of pressure on his opponents. Silva would fight Hayato Sakurai in 2001 in Osaka, Japan for the Shuto Middleweight Championship. Sakurai was 18-0 with 2 draws before the fight with Silva, but Anderson went on to win the fight by unanimous decision, giving him his first MMA championship and handing Sakurai his first professional loss. Silva would continue fighting in Japan for Pride, where he won 3 fights in a row before losing to Deju Takase. This loss was a huge upset considering Takase was 4-7-1 prior to fighting the 11-1 Anderson Silva. After the loss, Silva actually contemplated to retiring, but luckily fellow Brazilian MMA legend Minotauro Nogueira convinced Silva to continue fighting. After winning 2 fights in a row, Silva went to England where he successfully won the Cage Rage Middleweight Championship against Lee Murray by unanimous decision. Then on New Year's Eve in 2004, Silva lost again when he went to Japan where he fought Ryo Chonen. Ryo defeated Silva with one of the most impressive submissions I have ever seen when he threw a flying scissor heel hook that brought Silva down to the ground and forced him to tap immediately. After being cut by Pride after that loss, Silva went to England to defend his Cage Rage belt twice against Jorge Rivera and Curtis Stout. He then went to fight Yushin Okami in Hawaii, where the two were slated to fight in the opening round of Rumble on the Rocks 175-pound tournament. This was a tournament where Silva was a favorite to win, but while on his back, Silva threw an upkick that hit Okami in the face while both his knees were on the ground, thus making him a grounded opponent, which means that strike was illegal. Okami was given the chance to recover, but he instead took the disqualification win, which Silva called cowardly. But understandable, I wouldn't have wanted to continue fighting Anderson Silva. If the win is there, might as well take it, right? Anyways, Silva went back to defend his Cage Rage belt one more time, which he did successfully against Tony Strickland, with a beautiful reverse elbow that knocked Tony out. After this fight, Anderson Silva signed with the UFC in April 2006 with a multi-fight deal. The UFC even began promoting Silva prior to his debut against Chris Lieben at Ultimate Fight Night 5. Now, some people knew Anderson Silva was good, but not many people in the US knew who he was. I mean, prior to this, he only really fought in Asia and Brazil, but now he was fighting in Las Vegas, the fight capital of the world. And he was going up against a prime Chris Lieben, who not only had an iron chin at this point, but was also on a 5-fight win streak. But against all odds, Silva beat Lieben fast and in dominant fashion. The striking display of Silva was absolutely amazing to watch, and the fans agreed. When the UFC put out a poll asking who Anderson Silva should fight next, everyone unanimously voted for him to fight middleweight champion Rich Franklin. Now, at this point, Rich Franklin was viewed as the best middleweight in the world with a record of 22-1 and successfully defended his middleweight belt 2 times, which surprisingly at that point was the UFC record. Now, as great as Rich Franklin was at this point, Anderson Silva was just better. After throwing strikes everywhere to the body of Rich Franklin, Silva finished the fight 3 minutes into the first with knees to the body and nose. And if there was any questions that fight was a fluke, the two then fought again a year later with the result almost being the same, except this time Rich took the knees in early round 2. In between those 2 fights, Silva defeated both Travis Lutter and Nate Marquardt in dominant fashion. And after the second Rich Franklin fight, the dominance just continued with wins over Dan Henderson, James Irvin, Patrick Cote, and Thales Leites. In 2009, he moved up to 205 pounds to fight the former champion Forrest Griffin, who had just lost his light heavyweight belt to Rashad Evans. You would think Forrest would have the size advantage and motivation coming from his last loss as reasons that he's gonna do good in this fight. But the fight wasn't even close at all. It was so one-sided that Forrest himself joked about it years later. Anderson Silva was dodging everything Forrest Griffin was throwing at him. After a couple of knockdowns, Silva finished the fight with a right jab to the chin of a charging Forrest Griffin who was desperate to land something. Griffin laid on the mat and waved his arms to signify he wanted no more. Now at this point, everyone viewed Anderson Silva as an MMA god. He was not only winning all of his fights, but he was doing it with such grace and finesse. The guy would walk down his opponents with arms down, throw strikes that would come out of nowhere, and by doing this, he effectively got into most of his opponents' heads. I think that's why Anderson's fights were so entertaining, because he looked fearless. And at the same time, UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre was also at the height of his career. And when it came to discussions on who was the greatest of all time at that point, I would say more people sided with Anderson Silva, because as dominant as George was in his fights, he wasn't the finisher that Anderson Silva was. Anderson Silva was an MMA icon at this point who was loved by many, and that would be proved with his pay-per-view buys. But Silva's popularity took a quick dip when he fought Demian Maia at UFC 112 in Abu Dhabi. No, Silva didn't lose the fight, he actually went on to win the fight by unanimous decision, but the fight was highly criticized for its lack of action, mostly in part to Anderson just taunting and circling Maia. The crowd booed Anderson that night, and Dana White was openly frustrated with what went down. For me, this fight added another narrative to Anderson Silva's career. At this point, no one was believed to be a real challenge for Anderson Silva. It got to a point where people were not watching Anderson's fights to see what challenge his opponents would pose, but more to see how Anderson was going to win the fight. The UFC knew this, and they decided they wanted to give him a challenger that they believed would give somewhat of a challenge to Silva. And that man was Chael Sonnen, a wrestler who prior to fighting Anderson Silva at UFC 117 was 26-10 with one no contest at the time, but on a 3-fight win streak. Chael Sonnen was different from anyone Anderson Silva had fought before. Not only was Chael going to be the strongest wrestler that Anderson had faced, but Chael was not shy to trash talk Anderson Silva in the lead up to that fight. And this in itself was wild, because everyone feared Anderson at this point and wouldn't have dared to disrespect him in any way. But not only was Chael doing that, but he was also attacking Silva's home country of Brazil, and let's just say it got heated really quick between the two. Now, if you thought the trash talk from Chael Sonnen was surprising, what was even more surprising was how well he did against Anderson at UFC 117, which was on August 7th, 2010. For 4 rounds, Sonnen took Silva with his wrestling and held him down there while he was raining strikes from the top. It was crazy to watch this fight, because before that moment, Silva didn't even seem to get in the slightest of troubles in any of his UFC fights. But now he was on the brink of defeat, and going into the 5th round, Chael rocked Silva and continued with his top control. But while Chael was on top, Anderson threw his legs up to lock a triangle choke and began yanking on Chael's arm until Chael tapped out. The fight is widely regarded as one of the greatest comeback victories in MMA history. Silva took more strikes in that fight than he did in his entire career. Silva claimed after that he went into the fight with a cracked rib and fought against the doctor's advisory. The UFC definitely wanted to set the immediate rematch, but Chael Sonnen tested positive for synthetic testosterone after this fight and was having some legal issues with money laundering. So the two wouldn't fight for a second time. Yet. In the meantime, Anderson fought former UFC light heavyweight champion Vitor Belfort in a fight that many had interest in, considering how Silva looked in his last fight and how good Vitor was at that point. Vitor Belfort was on a 5-fight win streak prior to fighting Silva at UFC 126 on February 5th, 2011. And he was coming off a huge knockout win over former champ Rich Franklin, and that really added to the fire that Anderson may be in serious trouble against a fellow Brazilian. But after 3 minutes in the first round, Anderson threw a front kick to Vitor's face that sent him collapsing to the canvas, giving Silva the chance to finish it with strikes. This win really added to the legacy of Anderson Silva as one of the most exciting fighters in MMA, because at that point, he was the only one who was not only finishing his opponents, but was doing it with style. And he would continue that in his next fight against Yushin Okami at UFC 134. This fight was promoted as Yushin being the last person to defeat Silva, even though it was by disqualification. The rematch was a whole different story when Silva basically dominated the fight before dropping Okami and finishing him on the ground with strikes. Then the UFC set up the rematch with Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen at UFC 148 on July 7th, 2012. I remember at the time this fight being the most anticipated matchup the UFC had made at that point. I had friends who didn't even watch any MMA know about this fight, so that's when I knew it was a huge one. And a big part of that was due to Chael Sonnen, who was building the rivalry between him and Silva so well with his trash talk. Many people picked Chael to win this fight, who was coming off of 2 wins and absolutely dominated Anderson in the first fight before being submitted. Chael brought Anderson to the ground and used his wrestling to smother Silva with strikes. And then the second round came, and Chael made a huge error when he threw a spinning back fist that Silva dodged, which made Chael fall to the mat against the cage, where Silva threw a knee to Chael's body that hurt Chael real bad. Shortly after, Silva finished the fight off with strikes, and the rivalry was put to an end when Anderson invited Chael to his barbecue. And after his fight against Stephan Bonner at light heavyweight, who he dominated before finishing via strikes in the first round, Anderson Silva was at the top of the MMA world. He was sponsored by the likes of Nike and Burger King, which was huge back when the UFC allowed sponsors. Up to that point, he had the record for the longest UFC title reign of 10 title defenses. And even though he was 37 years old, he didn't show any signs of slowing down. Then UFC 162 came, where Silva was set to defend his title against rising prospect Chris Weidman, a 29-year-old from New York who was undefeated and coming off a very impressive win over Mark Munoz. He was a strong wrestler with some pretty good stand-up to add to that. He was a 2-1 underdog going into that fight against Silva, but was picked by some to get the upset, including then welterweight champion George St. Pierre, who said, "I believe it's a bad matchup for Anderson Silva. This fight will shock a lot of people." Now, going into the first round of this fight, Silva was confident. His arms were down, he was dancing around the cage, and for many opponents, it would have intimidated them. But Weidman stayed composed and was able to secure a takedown where he poured in the ground and pound. In the second round, Silva was continuing to taunt Weidman. But while his arms were down, Weidman was able to clip Silva with a left hook that sent him to the canvas and out cold after being finished with strikes on the ground. This was one of those moments I never thought I'd see in my life, but when I did, I was absolutely shocked. Even some people were in denial of the loss, saying Silva didn't take the fight seriously, that he was clowning around too much, and some say he threw the fight? I don't know. So of course the UFC booked an immediate rematch between the two, which was set for UFC 162 on December 28, 2013. The taunting from Silva was not around in this second fight. But even so, Weidman was able to clip Silva in the first and take him to the ground, where he used his wrestling to control Silva for the remainder of the round. Then in the second round, Silva started off by throwing heavy low kicks to the legs of Weidman. One of those low kicks was checked by Weidman so well that it immediately snapped Silva's tibia and fibula. It was one of the worst things I have ever seen in the octagon. The way Silva's leg just bended was gruesome to watch. And immediately after, when Herb Dean stopped that fight, the first thought that I had was, this is the end of Anderson Silva. Not only has he lost twice to the champ, but this looked like an injury that nobody could recover from. And even if he did recover from it, was he going to be the same fighter from before? So after missing the entire 2014 year due to his injury, Silva came back in 2015 against Nick Diaz, which I still think was one of the weirdest matchups the UFC has ever made. The fight was equally as bizarre, with very little action and more taunting from Nick Diaz. In the end, Anderson Silva won the unanimous decision, and it seemed like things were going in a positive direction for Silva once again. But then he failed his drug test twice, where he was positive for 2 anabolic steroids. Silva said the failed drug test was due to a sexual enhancement drug. But the commission wasn't buying it, so they suspended him for a year, fined him $380,000, and had his decision win against Nick Diaz changed into a no contest. And even after all this, he was still seen as the favorite in his return fight against Michael Bisping in 2016. And to be honest, he looked really good in that fight. He was aggressive, throwing good strikes, and almost finished Bisping in the third round with a knee. But the problem was Bisping looked really good in this fight as well. Bisping was able to keep up with the former champ, and even though he was on the brink of unconsciousness, he was able to stay in to secure the unanimous decision win. Silva, who was 0-3 and won no contest in his last 4, went up to light heavyweight to fight the champion Daniel Cormier on short notice after Daniel Cormier's challenger John Jones was pulled from their fight due to failing his drug test. The fight was changed into a non-title fight between Cormier and Silva and ended up being a dominant wrestling performance by Daniel, which earned him the unanimous decision victory. In February of 2017, Silva fought Derek Brunson at UFC 208. The fight was really close, with both guys getting in some really nice shots and Derek securing a couple of takedowns. Anderson Silva earned the unanimous decision victory, but many thought Derek Brunson got robbed, proof being the 19 out of 23 media outlets that scored the fight for Brunson. And in November of that same year, Silva failed his USADA drug test again, but was later exonerated after finding contaminated supplements in his failed drug test. Anderson Silva came back in 2019 to fight Israel Adesanya in a fight many viewed as a passing of the torch type of fight, considering Israel's style of fighting is very similar to Anderson's. which also made it an exciting fight with both guys landing some nice shots throughout the stand-up battle. The judges scored the unanimous decision victory to Adesanya, but Silva was applauded for staying in the fight against the future middleweight champion. 3 months later, Silva fought Jared Cannonier, where the fight was back and forth in the first before Jared threw a swing kick on the right leg of Silva that had him collapse in pain and have ref Herb Dean stop the fight. And as of right now, that was Anderson Silva's last fight, and people don't really know what his next move is going to be. But as it stands, Silva is currently 17-6 with 1 no contest in the UFC. And after going on an incredible 16-fight win streak that included 10 title defenses, which stands as second most of all time in UFC history, Silva has had only 1 win since 2013. So what was the reason for Silva's decline? There were many factors, which include that he was getting older while the competition was getting younger. Some people say that USADA's drug testing had a part of Silva's decline. Maybe the leg injury from the second Weidman fight changed the way he approached his fights. Or it could be all the above. But even after all this, I still view Anderson Silva as one of the greatest fighters of all time in MMA. Because at the time when we had Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre, and John Jones in discussion for who was the greatest of all time, I would say Silva's reign between 2006 and 2012 was the best answer as to why he deserved that title. His fighting style was so entertaining that it influenced a generation of fighters who now mix things up when they are striking, and they do it with style. I can't really think of another fighter who did that first and did it so successfully. But Anderson Silva did, and for that, I think he has rightfully solidified himself as an MMA legend. My name is Keon, and if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment letting me know what you think about Anderson the Spider Silva. But that's all I got for now, so I'll see you on the next one.